protecting and conserving public lands. Most of our work is on Bureau of Land Management lands and U.S. forest lands. We do a little bit of work on national wildlife refuges and national parks. Andrew is really steeped in this in many ways. He's been a grassroots organizer, and he'll talk about some of the work he's leading. Lives in Santa Fe. So he's a grassroots organizer, but he's also an ordained minister and is an associate pastor at the First Presbyterian Church in Santa Fe. And he and his wife, Jen, both went to Eckerd College, and he says it was his freshman year classes with Tim Beale that inspired him to go into the ministry. So for teachers who think they don't matter, they matter. Andrew is a living representation of that. And then we also have 2 other Eckerd graduates in the house, so there's definitely an overrepresentation of Eckerd. Couldn't be prouder about that. Andrew also worked with Clover. She led the campus ministry at Eckerd, and he helped lead that. So I'll let Andrew tell you. Oh, finally, Andrew does so much. I don't know. I don't think he sleeps. He also founded a nonprofit organization called EarthKeepers 360, and it is to involve faith leaders in conservation matters. So really has 3 full-time jobs. We are so lucky that we actually got him this Sunday to speak to us. He's going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll leave room for questions at the end. So please welcome Andrew Black.
Good morning. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to be with you all here this morning. As you can see from the topic on the screen, the piece that I want to discuss with you all today is how we're called to deal with difficult biblical texts and what these texts mean to protecting America's sacred lands. The personal passion that I have in speaking to you all this morning not only comes from an overwhelming love of God and God's creation, but also comes from having a 2-year-old who you'll see sitting in the back, who I'm very concerned with, is going to be experiencing massive climate change and natural disasters and kind of other major episodes in our world. And I think it's really critical that we obviously protect our earth and creation, and I'll talk about why that's kind of a deeper biblical ethic, not only for enjoying today's amazing natural resources and what the world has to offer, but also, of course, protecting future generations. So my hope is that this presentation will also be interactive. Feel free to jump in, keep it casual, and we'll have a good time today as we walk through some of the challenging biblical text around creation, but also at the same time look at what does that mean for protecting America's sacred lands. So after leading a trip of 40 faith leaders from Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah to visit with tribal leaders at Bears Ears National Monument in 2016, I formed EarthKeepers 360, which is a national movement focused on equipping spiritual leaders and faith communities with the tools needed to effectively engage modern environmental issues. And there you see a picture of the crew that went to Bears Ears, representing literally all kinds of faiths. We had nuns meeting with rabbis, meeting with tribal leaders and Presbyterian ministers and UCC and Disciples of Christ. Almost pretty much every major denomination was represented, and of course leaders from all 4 states were a part of that. As you can see, we work on a wide variety of issues, and we work with nearly 200 spiritual leaders and faith communities across the United States. Over this past year, I've worked with a chaplain in Georgia to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge with Mary Jo, but also worked with Presbyterian congregation in Dunedin, Florida to try to protect sensitive coastline in the Tampa Bay area. Worked with the San Carlos Apache in Arizona to try to protect Oak Flat, and we'll talk more about that today. And then, of course, working to protect Chaco Canyon and the Caja del Rio, which I'll talk more a little bit about in New Mexico, as well as on wildlife corridors and movement and connectivity between the Upper Rio Grande, which is the Colorado-New Mexico border, and how do we make sure that the jurisdictions and borders of human communities don't stop wildlife communities, and how can we work across state lines to really benefit wildlife and ecosystems to think in a much more broad way. So I also want to encourage you, I've got a sign-up sheet, I'll hand it to Mary Jo here in a second, to sign up for our weekly reflections. So we have weekly reflections that include conservation and spiritual leader quotes. Every week we send those out. We have thoughtful questions, and some churches even have an environmental creation care team that kind of reflects on those every week. Some folks journal on them. Some folks teach on their adult education with them. But we also include resources that'll how to take action. So public policies and planning that you can make a difference on the federal level and on the state level. But we also have within those weekly reflections opportunities for you to learn more about climate change and then also events that are happening in your area in Colorado and across the nation. So I'll hand Mary Jo that sheet, and if folks want to pass it around, basically just have an email and your name and a zip code, and that's it. But a lot of folks really like our weekly reflections. Some folks in this room I know are signed up for it, so feel free to pass that around. You'll have to forgive me because I have my 7th grade nephew's old notebook that he's no longer using, so I'm reusing some materials to sign up on. So, good conservation right there. So, here you're going to see a picture of Aldo Leopold, who helped found the National Wildlife Federation. How many of you are familiar with Leopold? All right, my kind of audience. Leopold, of course, was an author, a scientist, an ecologist, a forester, a conservation, and of course worked for the U.S. Forest Service. Actually was one of the first creators of the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico. He was also a professor at University of Wisconsin and wrote the Sand County Almanac, where he developed what he called the conservation ethic or the land ethic. And here you see Leopold's house in Tres Piedras, New Mexico. How many of you have ever heard of Tres Piedras or know where that is? It's right below Antonito, right on the Colorado-New Mexico border, and you can still visit Leopold's house. This is a log cabin that he built with his wife that was from Santa Fe, and he moved her up to Tres Piedras in the middle of literally nowhere still, and then, and of course, they lived there for about a year and a half, 2 years, and his wife was like, I'm a big city girl from Santa Fe, I got to go back to some population. And so they moved back from there, but you can still see Leopold's cabin. Mary Jo, would you mind reading this quote from Leopold?
No important change in human conduct is ever accomplished without an internal change in our intellectual emphases, our loyalties, our affections, and our convictions. The proof that conservation has not yet touched these foundations of conduct lies in the fact that philosophy, ethics, and religion have not yet heard of it.
Speaking to Leopold's point, I believe that faith communities and churches are going to be critical in raising not only education and awareness about conservation issues, but also at getting those deeper held values and convictions that will enable us to make the hard and necessary decisions that are to come in the future. We better be able to be talking to people about ethics and values and discernment and decision making and sacrifice. Who is better positioned to talk about these things in terms of how we got to think about this in American culture than the church? So, over this next decade, we'll be faced with enormous environmental challenges. For example, here you see a NASA satellite photo showing the massive methane cloud hanging over the Four Corners area above the Navajo Nation. This cloud is twice the size of Rhode Island or the size of Delaware, and it's caused by the burning of coal and oil and gas production in the Four Corners area. This energy production is not only having a major impact on climate, but also having a major impact on the area's water and wildlife. So when I used to work for U.S. Senator Martin Heinrich, he asked me to go to Farmington because one of the big issues that had recently occurred was a major flood in that area, and all of the erosion and sediment from the oil and gas pads up in the Four Corners flooded into the river of the San Juan. And that blocked the fishery, it impacted the bug life, was starting to kill off fish. It also made those waters unnavigable for river guides, and it also started to impact just the overall ecosystem and tourism of the area as it shut down many of the quality trout waters. How many of you have ever fished the San Juan or fly fishermen? It's a world-class river, but this impacted, obviously, major levels of it. So to deal with these problems, I believe that we're going to have to engage in hard critical thinking, to move to a deeper level of consciousness, and to redefine and reclaim what conservation really means in the 21st century. We're going to have to be bold in telling the truth that things are out of harmony, and when something is wrong, threatening the stability and integrity of communities, it is going to be the duty of the church to speak up. Yet before we can do this as a church, I believe that we must engage in the hard critical thinking that Martin Luther King Jr. speaks of here, by exploring and wrestling with some key scriptures and theology that come from our own tradition. I always love King's quote that nothing pains a person more than hard critical thinking. I think that is incredibly relevant to today, and I also like Albert Einstein's quote. Mary Jo hears me talk a lot about this, that no problem can be solved by the same level of consciousness that caused it. I think we really have to move to a deeper level about how we're thinking and being in this world. So with that said, I'm going to actually invite up my old college roommate and classmate that lives here in Denver to read, Mike Dirks, to read a chapter out of Genesis. And I'm hoping that you all can just kind of close your eyes and listen anew to Mike read this chapter, because I think it's really important. How many of you have read Genesis 1 lately? All right, good crew. I think it's really, really important because many of us probably haven't looked at this chapter since Sunday school. But it is probably one of the foundational chapters and one of the most driving and important forces on how we think about our relationship with God and the world. So Mike, if you could come up and read Genesis 1, we'll reflect a little bit on this. So just close your eyes and maybe listen anew to these words.
In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light was good, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with a seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the seas, and let the birds multiply on earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that that was good. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day.
Thanks, Mike. So, why start with Genesis? Genesis really does get at the central questions in terms of our theology. And it's, of course, at the heart of today's presentation, which is who is God and what is God concerned about? Who are we? And how do we orient ourselves toward God, toward one another, toward creation, and toward all that are around us? So obviously, Mike read that first chapter of Genesis, and it contains two accounts of creation. In the first account, which is the whole first chapter of Genesis, God brings order out of chaos. The Spirit hovers over the chaos as God creates the world and the universe in 6 days and then rests on the seventh. In the first 3 days of creation, God marks out 3 earthly realms: day and night, sky and sea, land and plants. On the second 3 days, God populates these realms with stars and planets, birds and fish, and land animals. When God speaks, all things come into being. God is indeed the creator of all things, from land to life. God is pleased, acknowledging the goodness of creation, right? You all heard that. The focus of this creation account then shifts from the cosmos to the Garden of Eden and the role that humanity will play regarding creation. Let's take a look at this. So here you see these two accounts from Genesis 1:26. At the very end of the last chapter, or the first chapter in Genesis, on the 6th day, God creates humanity in God's own image. Obviously, there's a whole separate presentation on the importance of what it means to be created in God's image and how to see one another that way. But today I want to focus on the latter half of this verse that I believe has been horribly misconstrued and used to justify humanity's unlimited power and exploitation of creation. There are many that are actually in the modern environmental movement and world that I work in that blame this very text for our ecological crisis. But let's take a look at this text more closely to see what it's really saying. So here you see then, it says, "Then God said, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion." The Hebrew you'll see up there is radah, and we're going to talk about this. "Over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals upon the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So in Genesis 1:26, we see that God gives dominion, quote unquote, over the animals. The first thing I want you to notice is that we are in pre-sin Eden, and that this power that's given to humanity is a humanity that is yet to know evil and knows only innocence and good. But the second thing that is really, really critical that I want you all to notice is that the word that's being translated as dominion is actually the Hebrew word radah. Can you all say that with me? Radah. We get a little Hebrew lesson in here. The word radah actually carries with it the meaning of to rule, or to rule responsibly, not in the sense of exploitation, but in the sense of a shepherd ruling over their sheep. The Hebrew word radah includes a sense of caregiving and even nurturing. While there is a sense of power or authority that comes with the word radah, it is one of royal responsibility and balance of power. In terms of this royal responsibility, and this is where things get really interesting in our translation, radah is the same word used later in the Hebrew Bible to discuss kings ruling over their subjects. In terms of balance of power, radah is literally the word used just a few verses earlier to describe the delicate balance in Genesis 1:16. And I quote, "God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule, or radah, the day, and the lesser light to rule, or radah, the night and the stars." Isn't it interesting that when it comes to the sun and the moon and the stars, we interpret that text as to rule over? But when it comes to us, look how we interpret it. Dominion. Same word, previous verses just right there, we interpret it to responsibly rule over. But when it came to us, look what we did. We have dominion, same exact word. This balance of power is not just about humanity's relation to animals, but about God's own grace and willingness to balance God's power by sharing responsibility for God's creation with humanity. Again, My interpretation and what I've talked to a lot of rabbis about is that Hebrew is a multivalent language, that it doesn't just carry one single meaning like we want to have in the English, that this word should really be the wholeness of this to rule responsibly over, right? That sense of radah carries that ruling with responsibility. In Genesis 1:28, you see the Hebrew word for subdue is kabosh, right? A familiar word to us. And the focus is on cultivating the earth, especially a difficult task in those days. While the verb may involve coercive aspects in later passages of the Hebrew Bible in dealing with hostiles, that's not the case here, right? Again, everything has been created good. There are no enemies. Rather, God gives power and task humanity with bringing order to the earth. Paradise is not static and requires humanity to work with God in the creative process. Also note that the command of radah, or to rule, is directly followed by the Sabbath. For bringing about order to creation also requires a sense of rest and reflection. We are not to be in full development mode. God is not in full development mode. The land is not in full development mode. It requires a sense of rest and reflection on what we are doing. As Timothy reminds us, we must use Scripture to interpret Scripture. And the first account of creation is then clarified by the second account. Here you see Genesis 2:7. Then the Lord God formed human from the dust of the ground and breathed into the nostrils the breath of life, and the human being became a living being. In Genesis 2:7, we see that humanity is not an enemy of the earth or of the land, but is in fact created out of the land and is one with the earth. God's spirit, breath, or ruach in the Hebrew, enters the dust of the earth to bring it to life. The message is clear. We are made of the earth, and we are made of God. The earth is part of us, and God is part of us. There is oneness with creation and oneness with the Creator. On Ash Wednesday, we regularly say the sacred words, "From dust you have arisen, to dust you shall return," as we impose these ashes on people's heads. And we tend to focus on that last part of the phrase, right? To dust you shall return, as we mark ourselves with those ashes. However, rarely do we actually take time to honor the spiritual significance and the importance of those beginning words of this sacred ritual. For when you say to dust, "From dust you have arisen," those words challenge us to no longer see creation as something outside of us, but as deeply within us and core to who we are and our identity as God's children. When we say, "From dust you have arisen," we are reminded that we all hold a sacred calling to care for and to be good stewards of God's creation and the gift God has given us. Yet this truth doesn't just come from our ancient biblical texts and traditions. Renowned scientist Carl Sagan, who's an astrophysicist and studied the chemical makeup of the universe, said these words, and I quote, "The cosmos is within us. We are all made of stardust. We are a way for the universe to know itself." The command to subdue the earth is further fleshed out by Genesis 2:15. The Lord God took the human and put the human in the garden to till it, and we'll look at that word, and to keep it. Here the Hebrew gets really interesting. The word that the Bible commonly translates as to till the earth is the Hebrew word abad. Want to say that? Abad, which literally means to serve. We are to serve the earth as a servant would serve their master, same word in Genesis 12:6. Or the people of Israel serve God, abad, used in Exodus 4:23. Isn't it interesting that when it comes to these other texts, we translate it as to serve, but when it comes to the earth, we translate it as to till and to work it? Could there potentially be an industrial mindset behind these texts and what's pushing those agendas? The human being is to be in service to the earth. Think about this text. The Lord God took the human and put the human in the Garden of Eden to serve it and to keep it. How would our world be different if that was how we translated these texts and we looked at those original languages? What agendas might have been pushing us to translate them in a certain way? The Hebrew word that's translated as to keep the earth is samar. And from the beginning of creation, God entrusts us to be keepers of the earth, or earth keepers, to share in God's work of good creation. To sum up these creation passages, biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann notes that a Christian understanding of dominion, or to rule responsibly, must be re-examined and discerned in the way of Jesus, who taught us that the one who rules is the one who serves. The greatest among us must be our servant, and in the task of ruling, you must follow the great shepherd, who is not in control, but who lays down his life for his sheep and his friends. Aligned with the life of Jesus, humanity is thus given power over creation, not to lord it over creation, but to serve creation with great humility and to join God in enhancing and working with creation. So, these themes obviously get picked up in the Psalms. Aligned with Genesis, the Psalms are filled with images of creation. Psalm 8 picks up on this theme of royal responsibility. For God has shaped the created order in such a way that the creator and the creatures share overlapping spheres of interdependence and creative responsibility. We are to serve God by ruling responsibly over God's creation. It's a great gift. But our rule and power is never independent of God, but always in submission to the will of God. As Psalm 24 reminds us, the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. We hold the earth in a sacred trust and are called to be responsible stewards of God's creation. It is not our planet, it is God's planet, and we are God's tenants. As Psalm 65 reminds us, when we look at the beauty of creation, we also understand the beauty of the Creator and their interconnectedness of creation. This was interesting. So I've been reflecting on what these post-Easter texts as a pastor mean to us and to our churches and our congregation. So with Easter just behind us, I think we all find ourselves asking, what does it mean to practice a life of resurrection? Living in a post-Easter world, I think the disciples were asking themselves the same thing, right? In Mark 16:15, Jesus responds to this question by offering some of his last teachings, telling the disciples and the early church to proclaim the good news to the whole of creation. Isn't that interesting? I'd never read that. Coming back to Mark and just reading that simple, short gospel book about proclaiming the gospel to the whole of creation. That the redemption and the reconciliation and the restoration and the renewal that happens on the cross is not just for humanity. It is for the whole of creation. And we are to speak the good news to the wildlife. Doesn't this sound a little St. Francis-y, right? Isn't that interesting? We think about that, Sister Moon or Sister Sun and Father Moon, those kind of things, right? Very St. Francis-like as we think about preaching the good news to the whole of creation and what that means and how that might have been different if we'd really lifted up that text and what that would have meant for early Christianity to go out and speak to the whole of creation. And here you see one of my favorite quotes, of course, from John Calvin. Creation is the theater of God's glory. Very mystical language for somebody that, many people just think is a legal scholar. But he, of course, reflected a lot on the Psalms. He's prayed a lot, spent a lot of time in creation. As someone who has a law degree and also a master's of divinity, I really appreciate Calvin because I think that mystical side, we interpret him from this very post-Enlightenment rational mind, but he has these kind of very mystical sayings that I think we need to look a little bit deeper at. Also this idea that, Karl Barth would later note that creation is an eruption of God's grace, a pure gift from the divine who is the ruler and sustainer of our lives. I love that, an eruption of God's grace. So let's talk about public lands in America. When you all think about public lands in America, what do you think about? National parks, yep. Any others? Forest. Yeah, so we got 640 million acres of public lands in the United States. Here you see there's 24 million acres of public lands in Colorado. U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management lands, national parks, U.S. Fish and Wildlife lands, right? Those are all part of it. Obviously, our public lands are also really critical to outdoor recreation, but also places of prayer, spirituality, solitude, cultural places, archaeological places. Our public lands are filled with all of this. You all live in Colorado, probably for a big reason is the public lands here, right? So, one of the things that most folks don't talk about, though, is what's going on with regard to energy development on our public lands. And the last administration had a mentality of what they called energy dominance, right? Notice that language. The Trump administration talked a lot about energy dominance, picking very much on those troubling Genesis interpretations. Over 7.2 million acres were leased to fossil fuel of public lands. These are your lands. They become locked up by industry. Now 1/5 of greenhouse gases now come off of public lands. These leases are expected to result in 5.95 billion metric tons of CO2. Public lands today account for 39% of U.S. coal, 21% of U.S. oil, and 14% of natural gas. You also have major mining threats. We'll talk about Oak Flat. Pebble Mine in Alaska, some of you may have heard about that. Boundary Waters in Minnesota. These are, the reason they're highlighted in yellow, these are some of the bigger victories that have occurred in the last year in terms of getting mining withdrawals from those areas and trying to protect those areas which were under huge jeopardy. Salmon fishery in Alaska, obviously Boundary Waters right there on the Canadian-U.S. border was under huge threat of mining, and those are public lands. And so that's been something that we've seen as a really productive thing under this administration, is dealing with those withdrawals of those areas. But how many of you have ever been to Chaco Canyon? All right, good group. So Chaco Canyon is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it tells an ancient and current story about the rich history, culture, spirituality, and resiliency of indigenous communities throughout the Southwest. Over the past few decades, BLM has leased over 90% of the federal land surrounding Chaco Canyon for drilling oil and gas. Companies have drilled over 37,000 wells in this area and built a sprawling network of roads, 15,000 miles of roads around Chaco Canyon. That's 5 times greater than the distance from Los Angeles to New York in road development. So Secretary Holland has been asked to create a 10-mile buffer zone for oil and gas drilling for the next 20 years around Chaco Canyon. There are over 4,000 archaeological sites that are just within this buffer zone. Obviously, they're still studying it. One of the really interesting things about Chaco Canyon that I think is relevant to you all, and obviously the work that I'll do on Caja, and I'll talk about that in a second, is that Chaco Canyon was really a cosmopolitan area. You had incredible astronomy going on. It was a cultural trade area, incredible kind of complex civilization in that area. And that area came out of Mesa Verde. And of course, from Chaco Canyon, you had a spreading of the pueblos along the entire middle and upper Rio Grande and southern Rio Grande. And so you kind of have many communities that still obviously very closely relate to this area from their ancestral home, their Pueblo spirituality. The other thing that's really fascinating is coming out of Chaco Canyon, you also saw a little bit of a spiritual renaissance. So if you look at some of the petroglyphs prior to that era, and we're talking 1250, the petroglyphs are much more simple and less elaborate than the petroglyphs coming out of that time frame after Chaco Canyon, which are called Rio Grande-style petroglyphs. Much more intricate, speak to a much bigger spiritual renaissance that occurred at that time. And so this was a definitive kind of spiritual renaissance that you would see, just like we would perhaps maybe talk about the Reformation, like, is occurring at that same time frame. Four Corners area also has an Oak Flat, which is a hot spot area in Arizona. This area is 60 miles east of Phoenix. It's in the Tonto National Forest. It's the homeland of the San Carlos Apache, which contains irreplaceable cultural and religious sites. There was a treaty done in the original treaty lands in the 1800s that found that this area should have been included in the San Carlos Apache Reservation. Of course, that treaty was never lived into. President Eisenhower also created a mineral withdrawal for this area in the 50s. Interestingly, under the National Defense Authorization Act, a military act that really has to pass to keep the funding of the military and veterans, Senator McCain swapped out this land at Oak Flat that was public land for private land, and gave about 5,000 acres for 2,500 acres of Oak Flat land, gave 5,000 acres of private land. Problem was the private land was valued at about $7 million, and the public land was valued at about $112 billion. Part of the reason is because it sits on an enormous copper reserve. And so what was originally the San Carlos Apache's ancestral home and traditional lands and spiritual lands then ultimately is being threatened with a private mine coming out of Rio Tinto, which is a mining company out of Australia and partnering with another company out of Britain. So this mine would use 250 billion gallons of water, and they would use this thing called blockchain mining. So if you think about a plateau, coming in from the side and basically blowing it up with canals of dynamite, causing the entire plateau to cave in on itself, leaving an enormous, mile wide plus crater that's 1,000 feet deep. 2 mile wide crater really is what would happen at Oak Flat. The whole area would be gone. You also would have 1.4 billion tons of toxic tailings, and the tailings dam would be 60 miles high. It'd be a massive, catastrophic thing. The thing that I find really interesting about Oak Flat is when talking to some of the San Carlos Apache leaders, and this is Wensler Noyes, the former chairman, and who is now the head of the Apache stronghold that you see with his daughter Vanessa up here, and myself and another pastor in Arizona working on this issue, is that they use this land as a sacred land to them to honor the coming of age of young women. So when women hit their first menstrual cycle, they do a whole ceremony tied to the sacred oak trees of Oak Flat and the dropping of the acorns and the fertility of the Mother Earth tied to the trees, tied to young women coming of age and going from a girl to a young woman. And this area is used for that for thousands of years, and obviously is under threat of being destroyed by this mine. And so you're not just talking about destroying a sacred area, you're talking about a woman's identity, her right to become a woman in that tradition, her ability to understand how that relates to Mother Earth and her fertility, and all of those complexities kind of tying in at Oak Flat. Really interesting area, really important area. Mary Jo and I have worked a lot on this and written a lot of different op-eds and trying to really push this. But this is important that you all talk to your senators, and talk to them about protect Oak Flat. Talk to your House of Representative members, tell them to protect Oak Flat. Talk to the Biden administration, tell them to protect Oak Flat. Because we're not, the mining company's mentality is, well, we'll just pick up those oak trees and move them. And we'll go somewhere else with them. And of course, they don't understand kind of the ancestral heritage of these oak trees, much less the significance of this area and what it means to kind of the entire identity of that tribe. So that's what's going on in Arizona. Right here is the Caja del Rio. I was going to show you all an amazing video that Mary Jo produced for the National Wildlife Federation it's called Saving Caja, which is an incredible video, but we'll make sure that we send the link out to you all, and I'll make sure if you put your emails down that you all see this video. It's a 5-minute video that really shows how incredible the Caja del Rio is. And one of the things that's most amazing about the Caja del Rio, and any of you who want to come tour with me, I took your all's youth group out there. We did a cleanup, we did a tour. It was awesome to have the Montview youth out with me on the Caja del Rio. I would be happy to take you all out there. So it's right outside of the city of Santa Fe. And the way I talk about this landscape is it's a landscape of great journey. What was once a Pueblo footpath, or what was once a wild game migration trail for deer, elk, pronghorn antelope, ultimately became a Pueblo footpath 10,000 years ago as Pueblo members, followed those animals for hunting and for moving into that area. Ultimately, 10,000, almost years later, it became one of the most important trade routes in all of North America and the Americas in general, as it ran from the El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, which ran from Mexico City to Oquewingue, and took 6 months to travel and bringing in the Spanish colonial world, obviously in the late 1500s and 1600s. That same trade route in the early 1900s became New Mexico Highway 1. Our vie for statehood, showing that we could show those Easterners that we too can engineer roads in New Mexico. And so in 1912, we obviously became a state, and New Mexico Highway 1 was considered one of the greatest engineering feats in the West in terms of road engineering. That same road that was once the Wildlife Migration Trail, a Pueblo footpath, the Camino Real, in the 1920s became Route 66, the mother road of Western expansion and bringing hope out of the Great Depression. All of that is alive on the Caja del Rio, showing the confluence of cultures and what it means to live in northern New Mexico. So here you see a map of the area. You can just see Santa Fe is that gray area. You see Los Alamos National Labs, Bandelier National Monument. It's this big green checkered area is what the Caja del Rio is. It's 106,883 acres of U.S. Forest Service and BLM land. It's an incredible area with cacti forests, beautiful area. It's an area, if many of you have ever driven from Albuquerque to Santa Fe, it's that kind of stretch of the big hill of La Bajada that you go up. It's all that to the left side that doesn't kind of look like much until you're on it, and then it starts to look like this. It's got incredibly diverse ecosystems, and it's an important wildlife corridor. So it sits between 5 different mountain ranges, the Jemez, the Sandias, the Manzano, all of those kind of areas, Sangre de Cristos. And wildlife move in and out of this area to migrate, and those wildlife ultimately are also moving towards your all's border, which is why it's important to Colorado. It's kind of the linchpin of wildlife movement in this area. The other thing that's really important about it is it's an important bird area. I don't know if any of you are birders, But all right. So it's got golden eagle, bald eagle, gray vireo, burrowing owls, all kinds of desert songbirds that are only found at much lower elevations and in much warmer climates. Has all of that kind of alive in it. It's got really incredible, valleys and plateaus. It's got 2 rivers running through it. But the other thing that is fascinating about it is it has over 4,400 petroglyphs in less than a mile. It's one of the most densely populated petroglyph fields in the entire United States. About a third of those petroglyphs are birds and flute players. Here you see some of the petroglyphs of the Caja, and I love this quote. "We don't have our histories written in books, they're written on the walls of our canyons." We're seeing major challenges to the Caja del Rio with illegal shooting, poaching, vandalism of petroglyphs, defacement of petroglyphs, stealing of petroglyphs. And of course, when you do that, you're ripping the pages out of that history book that can never be recovered. Petroglyphs, compared to kivas and pottery, are the most complicated and greatest telling of some of those cosmos creation myths, no different than if you ripped the first couple pages out of Genesis and then you said, start there. Tell us about how you understand how the world works and how it all came to be, and you don't have those pages. That's kind of what you're seeing in some of these challenges across Western areas. Bears Ears experiencing this, Caja's experiencing this, so we're running into all of that. Here's some of those birds that you see on the plateau. You also have the wildlife captured in the petroglyphs. So I took all these photos. Obviously, your bigger thunderbirds, right? Your hawks, your eagles, your bigger raptors are in this area. Of course, you got your rattlesnakey friends. They're hanging out there too. You got deer and pronghorn, or there used to be pronghorn, they were extirpated from the area, but you also have, deer and elk moving through the area as a wildlife corridor. Of course, you see the Camino Real kind of coming up from Mexico to the United States. You can still see the original wagon swalls of the Camino Real that go back to early 1600s on there. You see the Route 66 signs and some of those original signs. That's the mayor of Santa Fe, Mayor Weber, right there. And this is that escarpment that it went down. Originally, that was so high, it was 26-degree grade, that the original Model Ts had to go up that area backwards because there was no fuel injection. So they hired drivers from these local villages to go up the Caja. So that's a little bit of what we're working on some of the sacred lands in New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado. But I wanted to just leave you all with what you all can do as a congregation. So one of the things EarthKeepers is really working on is to be a climate-smart congregation. The EPA estimates that if every house of worship nationwide, which is about 300,000 houses of worship, cut back on their energy use just by 10%, over 200 million tons of greenhouse gases would not be emitted. That's the equivalent of keeping about 400,000 cars or 500,000 cars off the road. Energy Star has all kinds of things for you all for a worship facility on how you can improve those things. I printed out a couple of different handouts for you all on how to be climate-smart congregations. I think you all are doing a lot of this good work already in terms of replacing lighting, thinking about what it means to deal with more efficient appliances, how your heating and cooling is working. I wouldn't ask you all to do anything that we're not doing ourselves. I'm at First Presbyterian Church of Santa Fe, oldest Protestant church in the Southwest. It is a big footprint, complicated building, and we are working at all of this. I mean, we're putting in everything from water bottle refilling stations to a dishwasher that uses 1.2 gallons of water per 6 loads and does dishes in 3 minutes per load. So, big congregation to reuse plates and things like that makes a big difference. We have a huge preschool of over 110 kids. We're doing composting with them. We're also doing hard-to-recycle items. So we recycle used tennis shoes, those food pouches that kids eat. We recycle those. We use kids' toys, recycle clothing. So we're kind of trying to be a recycling hub for the community of all the things that are hard to recycle, but you can recycle. And that's through a program called TerraCycle, and anybody can do it, and it's free. So there's all kinds of ways that we can kind of continue to be a more climate-smart church. But I just wanted to leave you with these last couple slides. This shows average U.S. church electricity in the U.S. Obviously, a lot's going to cooling and heating, office equipment, lighting. There's all kinds of ways you all can consider this. This is part of the energy audit we did. We looked at our energy bills over the past 3 years. What's fascinating is you all probably, like us, were closed for some of the pandemic. Then you get a real sense of, where is the traffic coming in the building? How is it being used? What was it used like in the pandemic? What was it used like post-pandemic, pre-pandemic? What's that doing to our gas and our electric bills, right? What does that look like? That's a really interesting time frame, and we created all these graphs so you can kind of see that. Also doing gas consumption in the same way. We're paying about $40,000 a year in gas and electricity. Think about that ability to take that money and use it for other mission. Could we spend that on youth? Could we spend that on social justice projects? Could we spend that on creation care kind of stuff? We're also working to create gardens that are using the compost from the church that then feed our elders in our community and then can be taken to the homeless shelter? How can we create more of those kind of closed loops? Churches like this have really smart people in them. Think about how to tap those people as resources to be a more climate-smart congregation and how you all can make a big difference with that regard. Kind of last thing I would say is you can follow us on our website and our social media and our YouTube and Facebook. We're always kind of putting up different presentations like this. Always happy to work with you all. Get up to Colorado, get them out. I see Meg, one of my coworkers, just joined us, and Mary Jo from the National Wildlife Federation. I always got one of my good buddies here that lives here. My sister lives here, and we get to bring my daughter up to meet with the cousins, so Denver's obviously a second home, and is really important. I mean, it's also really important as a downstream state of you all to think about your all's water consumption, right? How that impacts people that live below you. We're going to be in some serious trouble, I think, in the Southwest, and I think it's time for us as congregations and as individuals to be really smart about these decisions and understand the role that we have in being really amazing stewards of God's creation and what it means to really, treasure that gift and to honor that gift and how that can impact human communities and wildlife communities across the Southwest. So, thank you all.
I warned Andrew that the time goes really fast, so we have about 7 minutes for questions. I'll go back to Peggy here. I don't need a mic. Yes, you do. Because live screen needs you.
Please be very specific about what we can do in the next 5 days about the Oak Flat. Should we email the White House, Department of Interior? Any links would be helpful.
Yes, so if you signed up for our newsletter, I will make sure that we feature that as one of our next take actions. But yes, the White House, Secretary Holland, Secretary Vilsack, and this is, of course, a big issue, right? Because you're hearing a lot about, meaningful consultation with tribes, free and informed prior consent, all of that kind of language, right? And then how is the White House actually living into that? And what does that look like on the ground? That is really, really critical in a place like Oak Flat. The San Carlos Apache also have brought this to court. They're suing on their First Amendment rights. And the reason they're suing on their First Amendment rights under freedom of religion, and they wanted pastors and people of faith like you all to get involved, is because they see this as their church. This is part of their sacred area, right? This would be like no different than, a huge company coming in here and saying, you know what, Montview, we're going to take your building down, we're going to destroy it, we'll go ahead and move you a couple blocks away and, go ahead and worship there and kind of deal with that later. And what's really interesting is that when Wensler Noyes, the chairman of the San Carlos Apache, wrote his U.S. Forest Service official comments on Oak Flat, he included a comment from a white woman who was a spiritual leader he invited to Oak Flat to come just be in the place, to pray, to be in solitude and silence with him out in nature, and then kind of see how she experienced the area. And she had a dream and a vision of, kind of uniting together with people across all races and cultures and kind of coming together to unite in this place is this, kind of very mystical prophetic vision that she had when she was staying at Oak Flat. He included this in the U.S. Forest Service comments. When the U.S. Forest Service printed the final comments, they stripped that language out of his comments. He, of course, called them very unhappy with his lawyer, saying, why did you remove her language? And she said, well, you included this language, and she's a white woman. And he goes, I'm well aware she's a white woman. And he goes, but she's a white woman. And he goes, so what are you trying to tell me here? That white people can't have such spiritual experiences like us in this place, that they need to have it in their buildings in the metro area in Denver at Montview, and they can't possibly have it at Oak Flat like us, and they can't also connect with the Creator and creation in ways that we do, but they have to do it over there and we have to do it over here. And he's like, are you trying to intentionally divide us from coming together and what the Creator wants to unite? And so those kind of things are going on, right? And so he, that chairman has asked me to tell that story to folks like you all because he's like, this isn't just a threat to their religion. It's a threat to your all's religion, where you can experience God, how you can come into, encounter the creation and the Creator, and where that's allowed to happen, and how the U.S. government sees that. So all of a sudden next week the government could say, well, Montview, you can no longer experience it here, but you can experience it over there. And that's where we're going to say that's allowed. But you certainly can't unite with the other folks that are Jewish in your community, or the Methodists, or these folks, or those folks, those tribal folks, because that's how they experience it in their own certain areas, and no one can certainly come together for a deeper place. So that sense of sacredness is really important that you all see that. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. We don't have time for more questions, but Andrew will stay after, and you can come up and talk to him. There's the list going around to sign up for the EarthKeepers 360. email list so that he will have links of how you can contact lawmakers in the White House and Secretary Holland about various lands we want to protect. I also want to mention EarthCare has a table out in the lobby, and there's some handouts about how to be a climate-smart congregation, and there'll be some handouts a little bit more information about Chaco Canyon. So feel free to take those. And Tim Beal's climate change book is out there too, so you can buy Tim's book. Thank you all of you who've come for all 3 lectures in our series about climate change and what people of faith can do. And like I say, feel free to come up and talk to Andrew afterwards and ask him any questions. Thank you all so much.
He taught me on the book of Esther, my first year of college, so which I've always appreciated his take on that. So.